There are stories that break your heart before they heal it, and this is one of them. Imagine a cold night in the heart of the city, the streets wet with recent rain, the neon lights flickering above stores that have long since closed. On the sidewalk, against a wall stained with time, sits a man with tired eyes and a little boy curled up against his chest, wrapped in nothing more than a thin blanket. To the world rushing by, they are invisible. Just another pair of nameless faces in the endless stream of people society has forgotten. But to each other, they are everything. The man's name was Daniel. Once upon a time, he had a small apartment, a steady job, and dreams that didn't seem too far away. But life, as it so often does, struck him with cruelty he never expected. A sudden layoff, bills piling up faster than he could manage. Then the eviction notice that tore the roof from above their heads. With no family to turn to, no one willing to extend a hand, Daniel found himself on the streets with his son, Ethan, who was only 6 years old. And if you asked Daniel what kept him alive, he would never say it was his own will. He would point to Ethan, that small boy with big eyes who still believed the world was good, and whisper, "He's the reason I breathe." The nights were the hardest. Ethan would shiver, even when Daniel gave him his own coat. Daniel told him stories to distract him from the hunger gnawing at their stomachs. Fairy tales he made up on the spot, stories where little boys just like Ethan became kings, where fathers found hidden treasures and built castles out of nothing but hope. Ethan would smile faintly, his eyelids heavy, and whisper, "Someday, Daddy, we'll have a home again." And Daniel would nod, even when doubt crushed his chest, because he could not let his son lose faith. Days blurred together, standing in soup kitchen lines, searching through trash bins for recyclables to exchange for a few coins, shielding Ethan from the dangers of the streets. Every day was a battle, and Daniel fought it silently, carrying the weight of 2 lives on his shoulders. He had promised himself that no matter what, Ethan would not feel abandoned. Ethan would not know the kind of loneliness that kills a child from the inside. But life has a strange way of twisting fate. One morning, as the city stirred awake, cars honking and shopkeepers opening their doors, Daniel and Ethan sat outside a small cafe. Ethan's cheeks were pale, his lips dry, and Daniel knew the boy was sick. He closed his eyes and prayed, not for himself, but for a miracle for his son. And perhaps someone was listening, because that was the morning she appeared. Her name was Isabella. She stepped out of a sleek black car, dressed in clothes that spoke of wealth and comfort, her heels clicking against the pavement. She should have walked past them like everyone else had. She should have turned her eyes away and pretended not to see. But she didn't. Something made her stop. Maybe it was the way Daniel wrapped his arms protectively around his son. Maybe it was the faint smile Ethan gave her despite his obvious exhaustion. Or maybe it was because deep inside, Isabella had a heart that still remembered what it meant to care. She crouched down, meeting Ethan's gaze. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly, her voice filled with warmth. Ethan nodded weakly, whispering, "We're fine." But Daniel, too proud to beg and too desperate to lie, said nothing. His eyes met Isabella's, and in that single moment, she saw the truth. A man who had lost everything except his dignity, and a child who deserved so much more. Without hesitation, Isabella went into the cafe and returned with 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate and a bag filled with pastries. She handed them over, and for the first time in days, Ethan's face lit up with genuine joy. Daniel thanked her, his voice cracking, words stumbling from lips unused to kindness. Isabella smiled, but her heart ached as she walked back to her car. She couldn't shake their faces from her mind, especially the boys. She had more than she could ever spend in her lifetime, and yet here was a child with nothing but his father's arms to protect him from the cold. That night, as she lay in her warm bed inside her sprawling mansion, she couldn't sleep. Her conscience whispered, "Do something. Don't let them disappear into the shadows again." The next day she went back, and the day after that. Each time she brought food, blankets, medicine for Ethan's cough. She started to talk with Daniel, learning pieces of his story, though he was hesitant to share. Pride made it difficult. But Isabella's kindness chipped away at the walls he had built around his pain. She learned he once worked in construction, that he had lost his wife years ago in a tragic accident, that Ethan was all he had left in this world. She learned that despite his circumstances, Daniel never complained, never spoke with bitterness. He only spoke of finding a way, somehow, to give Ethan a better life. Isabella found herself moved in ways she hadn't expected. For all her wealth, she had lived a life of emptiness. Parties, business meetings, luxuries that never filled the void in her heart. But here, on the sidewalk with this man and his son, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. And so, one evening, she made a decision that would change everything. She approached Daniel and said, "You and Ethan, you can't stay out here. Come with me. I have space. A guest house. A place where your son can sleep in a real bed." Daniel froze. He wanted to say yes desperately, but fear held him back. He had been disappointed too many times, betrayed by promises that never lasted. He looked at Isabella and asked, "Why? Why would you help us?" Her answer was simple, but it carried the weight of truth. "Because I can, and because I want to." Daniel stared at her, his heart torn between pride and the need to protect his son. And then Ethan tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, can we go? Please." That was all it took. That night, for the first time in months, Ethan slept on a real mattress, under warm covers, with the scent of clean sheets instead of damp concrete. Daniel sat by the window of the guest house, staring at the stars, overwhelmed with gratitude and confusion. He didn't know what this woman's intentions were, but he knew one thing for certain. She had saved his son. Isabella watched from the main house, a cup of tea in her hands, and smiled softly. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew in her heart that she had done the right thing. And perhaps, just perhaps, fate was weaving something extraordinary out of the broken threads of their lives. What none of them knew was that this act of kindness was only the beginning of a story that would defy every expectation. Because love has a way of appearing in the most unexpected places, often when we least believe we deserve it. Nights were the hardest. The city lights flickered in the distance, mocking the darkness where Daniel and Ethan lay huddled together. The boy would fall asleep first, his small hand still clutching his father's shirt, as if afraid that if he let go, his father might disappear. Daniel, however, barely slept. His mind raced with thoughts, memories of a home they once had, of a job that had given him dignity, of a wife who had left when the struggles became too heavy. He thought about the future, too, but only as a blur, because he had no plan beyond making it through each day. And yet, even as despair gnawed at him, Ethan's steady breathing beside him kept him from giving up completely. There was something about the child's presence, his trust, that reminded Daniel he still had a reason to fight. One rainy evening, as the streets emptied and people hurried indoors, Daniel searched for a dry corner where he and Ethan could rest. His clothes were soaked, his body shivering, but he kept his boy wrapped inside his worn jacket. They found shelter under an awning of a closed cafe, and Daniel crouched low, whispering stories to his son to distract him from the storm. "Once upon a time," he said softly, "there was a little knight who lived in a kingdom of light. He had no armor, no sword, but he had a brave heart. And because of that, he could face dragons no matter how big they were." Ethan's tired eyes lit up, his lips curling into a faint smile, and Daniel held onto that smile as if it were a candle in the dark. He didn't know that, not far away, someone was watching. Clara had just left a charity event downtown. The wealthy woman was used to luxury, her world full of chandeliers and expensive gowns. But she also carried a quiet restlessness inside her. Despite her success, her heart often felt empty, and she longed for something real, something that wasn't measured in bank accounts or status. As her car slowed near the cafe, her eyes caught sight of a man crouched with a boy in his arms, shielding him from the rain. Something about the scene pierced her deeply. She couldn't look away. The tenderness in the man's eyes, the way he prioritized the child's comfort over his own misery. It was a love she rarely witnessed in her world of polished facades. She asked her driver to stop. For a moment she hesitated, wondering if she was being foolish. People in her circles didn't roll down their windows for strangers, much less homeless ones. But something stronger than hesitation moved her. She stepped out into the rain, her heels clicking against the pavement, her umbrella sheltering her only partially. Daniel stiffened when he saw her approach. He pulled Ethan closer instinctively, as if afraid the stranger might take him away. Clara, sensing his fear, knelt slightly so she wouldn't tower over him. "I don't mean any harm," she said gently. "I just saw you two here. Do you need help?" Daniel's pride flared. He had been offered coins before, pity disguised as kindness, and he had always rejected it. But this was different. Her voice wasn't condescending. Her eyes weren't filled with disgust. Still, he muttered, "We're fine." Clara studied him, recognizing the stubbornness of a man who had lost much but still clung to dignity. Then she looked at the boy, who peeked at her from behind his father's jacket, his big eyes filled with both fear and innocence. Clara felt something shift inside her, an ache she couldn't name. "Would you at least let me bring you some food?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated, but Ethan's small voice broke through. "Daddy, I'm hungry." The words stung Daniel like a blade. He looked down at his son, then back at the woman, his defenses faltering. With a heavy sigh, he nodded. "Food," he said quietly. Clara smiled, relieved. She offered her hand to the boy, but Ethan buried his face in Daniel's chest. Clara didn't take offense. She only nodded and promised to return quickly. True to her word, she came back minutes later with warm sandwiches and bottles of water. Daniel watched her closely as she handed the food over, and for the first time in weeks, he and Ethan ate a meal that wasn't scraped from leftovers or dug from the trash. The warmth of the bread spread through Daniel's chest, and he murmured a quiet thank you, almost against his will. Clara didn't leave after that. Something about them drew her in, and though she had meetings, parties, and obligations waiting, she lingered. She asked Daniel about himself, about the boy, but he gave little away. Still, she caught glimpses in his answers. His voice tightening when he mentioned work, softening when he spoke of his son. Ethan gradually warmed up too. Between bites of his sandwich, he told Clara that he wanted to be a doctor someday, because doctors help people get better. Clara's eyes misted. "I think you'll make a wonderful doctor," she told him, and the boy's grin was wide enough to light up the rain-soaked street. For Daniel, the encounter felt strange, almost unreal. People usually ignored him, avoided eye contact, pretended he didn't exist. Yet here was a woman in a silk dress, kneeling in the rain, treating him like he was worth listening to. It unsettled him, but it also stirred a small flicker of hope he thought he had lost. When she finally stood to leave, she looked at both father and son with a sincerity that stunned Daniel. "I'll see you again," she promised. Daniel didn't believe her. People always said things they didn't mean. But as he tucked Ethan into his side and watched her car drive away, he couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had just shifted course, even if only by a thread. That night, Daniel lay awake under the same awning, his son sleeping peacefully with a full stomach. His mind replayed Clara's words, her kindness, the way she had looked at Ethan like he was more than just a homeless boy on the street. For the first time in a long while, Daniel whispered a prayer he wasn't even sure he believed anymore. "Maybe tomorrow will be different," he murmured into the darkness, and deep down, a part of him dared to hope that it might. The following days unfolded differently than Daniel expected. Normally, each morning was a cycle of gathering scraps, shielding Ethan from the cruelty of strangers, and searching for a safe corner to rest. But after that night in the rain, something changed. Clara came back. Not once, not twice, but every single day. At first, Daniel thought it was a coincidence, that perhaps her path simply crossed theirs. But soon it became clear, she sought them out intentionally. She didn't come with flashy gestures or hollow pity. Instead, she brought simple things. Warm meals wrapped carefully so they wouldn't spoil, blankets that still smelled faintly of lavender, and books for Ethan. She would sit on the cold pavement with them, not caring about her expensive clothes, and read aloud while Ethan leaned against her shoulder, his small fingers tracing the pictures. Daniel watched silently, torn between gratitude and unease. He had spent so long fighting the world alone that trusting someone else felt unnatural. And yet, each time Clara showed up, a little of the weight on his chest lifted. One morning, as the city bustled around them, Clara crouched by Ethan and handed him a brightly colored notebook. "This is for your dreams," she said with a smile. "Whenever you think of something you want to be, or something you hope for, you can draw it or write it here." Ethan's face lit up, and he quickly scribbled with the small pencil she had tucked inside. When he showed it to her, the page was filled with stick figures. One tall, one small, both holding hands beside a house. Above them, he had drawn the sun. "This is me and Daddy," Ethan explained. "And that's our home." Clara's throat tightened. She glanced at Daniel, whose eyes were fixed on the ground. His pride kept him silent, but his trembling jaw betrayed the storm of emotions inside him. She reached out and gently touched his arm. "He deserves that," she said softly. Daniel finally looked at her, his eyes guarded yet vulnerable. "I can't give it to him," he admitted in a voice rough from years of struggle. "I failed him." Clara shook her head firmly. "You haven't failed him. You're still here. You love him. That's more than many children ever get." Her conviction startled Daniel. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but the truth in her words disarmed him. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a broken man, but as a father doing his best. As the weeks passed, Clara's involvement grew. She convinced Daniel to let her take Ethan to a nearby clinic for a checkup. The boy's health was fragile, but nothing that proper nutrition and care couldn't mend. She made sure he received vitamins, shoes that actually fit, and clothes that kept him warm. Daniel, however, resisted when she offered help for him. "I don't need charity," he snapped once, his pride flaring. Clara didn't flinch. "This isn't charity," she said calmly. "It's kindness, and there's a difference." Her words lingered with him long after. One evening, Clara invited them to sit with her at a small cafe. Daniel balked at first, uncomfortable with the idea of stepping into a world that didn't feel like his. But Ethan's eager eyes melted his resistance. They sat at a corner table, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Daniel tasted hot soup served in a real bowl, not a paper container. He caught his reflection in the cafe window and barely recognized himself. Tired, unshaven, but alive in a way he hadn't been in years. Ethan giggled between spoonfuls, crumbs sticking to his cheeks, and Clara laughed along, the sound warm and genuine. For a fleeting moment, Daniel felt like a normal father, like the three of them belonged together. But reality still clawed at him. Late that night, as Ethan slept beside him, Daniel whispered to himself, "What does she want? People like her don't stay. They look, they pity, they leave." He wanted to believe otherwise, but scars from abandonment ran deep. Clara had money, power, and choices. He had nothing but his son. The idea that their paths could intertwine seemed impossible. And yet, his heart betrayed him each time she smiled, each time she reached for Ethan's hand with such tenderness. Clara, too, wrestled with feelings she hadn't expected. She told herself she was simply helping, that it was her responsibility as someone with means. But every time she left Daniel and Ethan, she felt an ache of longing. She found herself thinking of them at night, wondering if they were warm enough, if Ethan was safe, if Daniel was sleeping or still awake, staring at the ceiling of the sky. She had lived in mansions, traveled the world, and dined with influential people, but none of it had ever touched her heart the way these two did. Her friends noticed the change. At gatherings, when they asked where she had been, she dodged their questions. When they pried further, she confessed only that she had met someone who reminded her of what really mattered. "Don't get carried away," one of them warned. "You don't know these people. They could take advantage of you." But Clara ignored their cynicism. She saw something in Daniel that others couldn't. Strength wrapped in humility, love hidden beneath layers of pain, and she couldn't walk away. The turning point came one cold evening. Daniel and Ethan were huddled against the chill when Clara appeared, holding 3 tickets. "There's a community play tonight," she said, her voice bright. "It's simple, nothing fancy. But I thought Ethan might enjoy it." The boy's eyes sparkled instantly, but Daniel hesitated. "We don't belong in places like that," he muttered. Clara knelt before him, her gaze unwavering. "You belong wherever your son belongs. And he belongs anywhere joy is found." Against his doubts, Daniel agreed. That night, they sat together in a modest theater. Ethan clapped and laughed, his face glowing with wonder. Daniel watched his son more than the play, memorizing the sound of his laughter. Clara, seated beside them, reached out at one point, her hand brushing Daniel's. He didn't pull away. In that silent gesture, something shifted. An unspoken connection, fragile yet undeniable, blooming between two souls who had lived worlds apart. When the play ended, Daniel whispered to Ethan as they walked out, "Did you like it?" The boy beamed. "It was the best night ever." Clara caught Daniel's eyes, and in that moment, he realized he was standing on the edge of something he never thought possible. A woman from a world of light had stepped into his darkness, not to pity him, but to share the weight. And though fear still lingered, hope began to burn brighter than it ever had before. The days after the play carried a new kind of warmth, even though winter's chill settled deeper into the city streets. For Daniel, something subtle but powerful had changed. The memory of sitting inside that small theater, with Ethan's laughter echoing in his ears and Clara's hand brushing against his, played again and again in his mind. It was the kind of memory that didn't fade. It clung, reminding him that life could still hold beauty, even for someone like him. Clara's visits became more frequent, almost a rhythm in their lives. She would arrive with small surprises, a thermos of hot cocoa, mittens she knitted herself, a second-hand backpack filled with coloring books and pencils for Ethan. But more than what she brought, it was her presence that left the deepest mark. She didn't look at Daniel with pity, and she never treated him as less. Instead, she spoke to him as an equal, as if his struggles didn't define him but revealed his strength. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench watching Ethan chase pigeons, Clara turned to Daniel with a seriousness in her eyes. "I want to help you, not just with food or clothes, but with something real, a chance." Daniel stiffened. "A chance at what?" She took a breath. "Work, stability, a way to rebuild." Daniel's heart pounded. He hadn't worked in years, not since losing everything. He'd applied countless times back then, but the gaps in his history and the shame of his situation always closed doors before they opened. "No one's going to hire me," he said bitterly. "I'm a man who lives on the streets." Clara leaned closer, her voice steady. "Then let me open the first door. I own several businesses, Daniel. One of them could use someone with your skills. All I ask is that you try." The word own struck him like a stone. He had always suspected she came from wealth, but hearing it aloud made the gap between them feel infinite. And yet, she wasn't offering a handout. She was offering dignity. Ethan's laughter in the distance made Daniel's chest ache. He looked back at Clara, searching her face for hidden motives, but found only sincerity. After a long silence, he nodded. "All right, I'll try." The next morning, Clara drove them to one of her properties, a bakery on the edge of town. The owner, a kind older man, greeted Daniel warmly. "Clara tells me you're hardworking," he said, extending a flour-dusted hand. "We could use that around here." Daniel stepped inside, the smell of fresh bread wrapping around him like a memory. He had worked construction before, odd jobs here and there, but standing in that bakery felt different. For the first time in years, someone saw him as capable. His first weeks were hard. His body wasn't used to long hours, and he carried the fear of failure like a weight on his shoulders. But every evening, when Clara came to check on him and Ethan, her encouragement pushed him forward. Ethan would sit in the corner of the bakery after school, scribbling in his dream notebook while Daniel worked. Sometimes, Daniel caught his son drawing three figures now, himself, Ethan, and Clara, all inside a house with smoke rising from the chimney. Slowly, Daniel's confidence grew. He began earning enough to provide meals without relying solely on Clara. He found small joy in handing Ethan a sandwich he had bought with his own wages. "Your dad got this for you," he'd say, pride softening his voice. And Ethan's smile, wide and unshaken, gave Daniel strength to keep going. Clara, watching from the edges, felt her heart swell. She had admired Daniel's resilience from the start, but now she was seeing the man beneath the scars. Humble, hard-working, fiercely devoted to his son. She hadn't expected it, but feelings deeper than compassion began to stir within her. She found herself lingering in the bakery longer, laughing at Daniel's dry humor, feeling her pulse quicken when his eyes met hers across the counter. Yet not everyone approved. One evening, Clara's father confronted her at their family estate. "I hear you've been spending time with a man from the streets," he said sternly. "This is beneath you, Clara. People will talk." She met his gaze without flinching. "Let them talk," she replied. "He is more honorable than half the people you entertain at your dinner table." Her father's eyes hardened, but Clara turned away, unwilling to let wealth dictate her heart. Meanwhile, Daniel wrestled with his own fears. Late at night, when Ethan was asleep, he thought about Clara. Her kindness, her laughter, the way she believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. A dangerous hope had started to bloom inside him, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than a benefactor. But then reality struck. She was a woman of means, elegance, and influence. He was a man rebuilding from ashes. Could someone like her truly choose someone like him? One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of gold, Daniel locked up the bakery and found Clara waiting outside. Ethan ran to her, hugging her tightly, and she lifted him into her arms, her laughter filling the air. Daniel watched them, his throat tight. It looked so natural, so right. His son in her arms, her smile bright against the fading light. Clara noticed the look on his face. "What is it?" she asked gently. Daniel shook his head, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. "I don't understand why you do all this. Why you stay." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Because you and Ethan remind me what matters. Because you are good. Because you make me feel alive in a way money never has." The world seemed to still. Daniel's heart raced, caught between disbelief and longing. He wanted to tell her how much she had changed his life, how deeply he admired her, how the thought of her had kept him warm on the coldest nights. But before he could speak, Ethan tugged at his sleeve and said, "Daddy, can Clara come with us tonight? I don't want her to go." Clara's eyes softened as she looked at Daniel. And in that moment, he realized something profound. She wasn't just helping them. She was becoming part of them. And though neither dared to say it aloud yet, both knew their lives were weaving together in ways that no accident of wealth or circumstance could unravel. As winter deepened, the city grew harsher. The winds cut colder, the nights stretched longer, and yet inside Daniel's heart, there was a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in years. Clara was no longer just a kind presence. They had become a team, a quiet but undeniable force working together for Ethan, for a future neither of them dared to dream before. But as their bond grew, so did the whispers. The bakery's customers began to notice Clara's frequent visits, her gentle laughter echoing against Daniel's deeper voice, Ethan clinging to her hand as though she were already family. Some smiled at the sight, but others raised eyebrows. Words traveled quickly, and soon Clara found herself the subject of curiosity and, at times, disdain. One afternoon, as Clara left the bakery, two women from her social circle crossed her path. They offered stiff smiles, then whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "Imagine a woman like her lowering herself for a man like that. She could have anyone, and she chooses a beggar." Clara's steps faltered, but only for a moment. She had long grown accustomed to the sharp edges of gossip, yet now the words cut deeper. Not because she doubted Daniel, but because she feared how such judgments might wound him. Daniel, too, began to notice. Though Clara never spoke of it, he could feel the weight of their difference pressing against them. One night, as they sat together outside the bakery, while Ethan slept nearby, Daniel spoke quietly. "You don't have to do this, Clara. You don't have to tie yourself to someone like me. I know what people must say. Clara turned, her eyes flashing with determination. Let them talk. They don't see what I see. They don't know the man who worked his hands raw to give his son dignity. They don't hear the way Ethan laughs when he's with you. They don't know how strong you are, Daniel. Her words silenced his doubts, but deep inside, the fear remained. Not for himself, he had learned to live without approval, but for her. He didn't want her reputation tarnished because of him. The following week, Clara invited Daniel and Ethan to her home for the first time. It was a sprawling estate, elegant yet warm, filled with family photographs and the faint scent of roses drifting through the halls. Ethan's eyes widened in awe. "Daddy, it's like a castle," he whispered, clinging to Daniel's hand. Clara smiled gently. "Then that makes you a prince tonight." Daniel felt out of place. His worn clothes and calloused hands stark against the polished floors and chandeliers. But Clara guided them through as though they belonged, never once letting him feel less. That evening, she cooked for them herself, laughing as Ethan helped stir the sauce and spilled flour across the counter. Later, as Ethan fell asleep on the couch, Daniel and Clara sat in the quiet glow of the fireplace. The flames flickered, painting her face in shades of amber. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Clara broke the silence. "Daniel, I need you to understand something. This isn't pity. This isn't charity. What I feel for you, it's real. I don't want a life without you in it." Daniel's breath caught. He had imagined her saying those words in the secret corners of his heart, but hearing them aloud was overwhelming. He struggled for words, finally whispering, "Clara, I don't have much to give. Just myself. Just what's left of me." She reached for his hand, her fingers soft against his rough skin. "And that's all I've ever wanted." The moment hung between them, fragile and infinite, until a knock at the door shattered it. Clara's father entered, his expression thunderous. His eyes swept over Daniel, disapproval carved into every line of his face. "So it's true," he muttered. "You've invited him into our home." Clara stood quickly. "Father!" But he silenced her with a raised hand. Turning to Daniel, his voice dripped with disdain. "You should be ashamed. A man like you doesn't belong here, doesn't belong with her. Do you think you can climb into our world just because she feels sorry for you?" Daniel rose slowly, his fists clenched at his sides, but his voice was steady. "I don't want your world. I only want the chance to build one of my own, for my son. Clara's kindness doesn't shame me. It humbles me. And if you can't see her happiness, then you don't deserve her respect." For a moment, silence reigned. Clara's father glared, but Clara stepped firmly between them. "Enough, father. This is my life, not yours. And I won't stand by while you insult the man who has shown me what real strength looks like." Daniel felt a surge of pride and fear all at once. He had stood his ground, but he knew the battle wasn't over. Clara's world and his were colliding, and the fallout could either tear them apart or forge something stronger. That night, as Daniel and Ethan walked back to their small room above the bakery, Ethan's sleepy voice broke the silence. "Daddy, do you think Clara could be part of our family one day?" Daniel's chest tightened. He looked down at his son, who gazed up with innocent hope. And though doubt still shadowed him, Daniel couldn't help the faint smile that touched his lips. "Maybe, son," he whispered. "Maybe." What Daniel didn't know was that Clara was already planning for that possibility. Not out of impulse, but out of a love that had grown roots deeper than either of them could deny. She was ready to face whatever storms came, because some things were worth fighting for. And as the winds of change stirred around them, neither Daniel nor Clara realized that their greatest test was still to come, but so was their greatest joy. The weeks that followed were unlike anything David or Ethan had ever experienced. For the first time in years, they woke up not to the sound of cars rushing past them, not to the chill of the pavement seeping through thin blankets, but to sunlight streaming softly through curtains, the smell of breakfast in the air, and the warmth of a home. Each morning Ethan would come bounding into David's room, climbing onto the bed, giggling as though he couldn't believe the life they were living now was real. David would pull him into his arms, still amazed himself, whispering, "It's real, buddy. We're here." Claire had done more than open her door. She had opened her heart. She didn't treat them like guests or charity cases. She treated them like family. First, David struggled with this. He had spent so many years surviving with nothing, relying only on himself, that he wasn't used to accepting help so freely. But Claire's kindness wasn't overbearing. It was steady, natural, and genuine. Slowly, he allowed himself to breathe again, to trust again. Claire enrolled Ethan in a local school, where the little boy quickly blossomed. The boy who once clung tightly to his father, shy and quiet from the harshness of life on the streets, now laughed easily with classmates, raised his hand to answer questions, and ran to show Claire and David every little thing he learned. His drawings changed too. No longer were they filled with gray sidewalks or dark skies. Now they had sunshine, flowers, and stick figures of 3 people holding hands. David found himself adjusting too. Claire encouraged him to pursue his passion for woodworking, something he had nearly forgotten in the grind of survival. With her support, he began making small pieces of furniture in her garage. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, but soon neighbors began to notice his skill. A friend of Claire's ordered a handmade rocking chair, then another asked for a custom table. Before long, David had a small but growing business. For the first time in years, he stood tall, not just because he had shelter, but because he had purpose. Through it all, Claire was there. She never once made him feel like he owed her, never once reminded him of the difference in their worlds. Instead, she made him feel like they had always been meant to find each other. Yet even as their bond deepened, David wrestled with something inside him. Late at night, when the house was quiet and he watched Ethan sleeping peacefully in his own bed, David often sat awake thinking, how had his life changed so drastically? From sleeping under bridges to sitting at a dinner table, sharing laughter with a woman whose kindness had rewritten his story. It felt almost too good to be true. He wondered if it was fair to let Claire give so much of herself to them. He worried that his past, filled with struggle and scars, might one day cast a shadow over this new life. But Claire seemed to sense his fears without him speaking them. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, she found David on the back porch, staring up at the stars. She sat beside him, close but not crowding, and simply said, "You don't have to question this, David. You and Ethan belong here, not because I gave you anything, but because you've brought something into this house I didn't know I was missing. You've given me family." Those words stayed with him, echoing louder than his doubts. As the months passed, something undeniable grew between them. It was in the way Claire smiled when David made her laugh, in the way David's eyes softened when he saw her with Ethan, in the small moments they shared without even realizing they were becoming a family. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was steady, like the roots of a tree growing deeper, unseen but unshakable. One evening, after they had spent the day at a park, watching Ethan run and play, David turned to Claire. His voice trembled as he said, "I don't know how to say this, but I can't imagine life without you now." Claire reached for his hand, her eyes glistening. "Then don't," she whispered. In that moment, all the walls David had built over years of hardship crumbled. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream not just of surviving, but of loving, of building a future. When he finally asked Claire to marry him, it wasn't with a grand gesture or lavish plan. It was simple, heartfelt, and raw, just as their journey had been. He knelt in the small garden Claire had planted, holding a ring he had saved for and chosen with care. His voice shook as he told her that he wanted to spend the rest of his life proving that her kindness had not been in vain. Claire didn't hesitate. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Yes." Their wedding was small but beautiful. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about love. Ethan stood proudly beside his father, wearing a tiny suit, beaming brighter than the sun. The moment Claire said her vows, promising not just to David but to Ethan too, the boy threw his arms around her, calling her Mom for the very first time. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. From that day forward, they were no longer just people who had crossed paths by chance. They were a family, David often thought back to those cold nights on the streets, the hopelessness he once felt, and each time he marveled at how life could turn, how a single act of kindness could change everything. He had once believed his story was written in stone, that he was destined to live in struggle, to raise his son in shadows. But Claire had shown him that even the darkest chapters could give way to light. Years later, as David watched Ethan grow into a strong, confident young man, he often told him, "Never forget, son, it was kindness that saved us. Always carry that with you." Ethan never did forget. He carried not just the memory of hardship, but the lesson that love and compassion could build bridges stronger than circumstance. And Claire, she often said that meeting David and Ethan was the greatest blessing of her life, that she had once thought wealth was measured in things, but they had shown her the true richness of love, of laughter around a dinner table, of holding hands when the world felt heavy. Their story wasn't perfect. Life still had challenges, but they faced them together, bound not by chance but by choice, by a love born from kindness and grown into something unbreakable. In the end, the story of a man and his little boy living on the streets became the story of a family, proof that no matter how dark the path may seem, light can always find its way in. And sometimes that light comes in the form of one person who dares to stop, to care, to see you not as you are, but as who you could be. David often said, with tears in his eyes and Ethan smiling beside him, "We thought we had nothing, but now we have everything that matters." And they did.